We will, thank you, Miguel. We will also, in case there's sensitive discussions that will take place today during the briefing, those we will take out from the recording that will become public. Besides that, I'd like to encourage you to use the chat function to post any questions that you have during the briefing. In many cases, we don't really have a lot of time at the end of the meeting to have kind of organized Q&A. So in today's meeting, I would especially encourage you to raise questions in the chat. And if you have specific questions regarding the resolutions that we will focus more on today, in that case, when we discuss political finance, environmental crime and corruption, and the review mechanisms next phase, when we present those specific resolutions and their outcomes, we will also open the floor for questions immediately after the presentation. Of course, keep yourself muted on mute at all times, and we will also add links to the different resources we're presenting and discussing today. So keep following the chat not only for questions but also for these important resources. So. Let's jump right into it. I think all of us are well aware of the backdrop of CoSP 11. It's still an extremely challenging geopolitical context and situation, which definitely affected a lot of the discussions and negotiations. And we will talk about this a little bit more in detail. And at the same time, as civil society, as NGOs worldwide, many of us are facing immense challenges in terms of the funding cuts. And this, of course, impacts the ability of many organizations to travel and to engage in on the international fora, and organizations, of course, have to prioritize. And at the same time, and probably even more importantly than money, it's actually the shrinking civic space on the national level, where we're following, including other organizations, reports on what's actually happening on the national level, including with regards to those of us who are fighting corruption. Qatar was the host of a COSP 11, as you all know. At the end of the day, wasn't there personally, and I regret, for not seeing many of you there in person. But to my understanding, as a host, things were dealt quite smoothly. At the end of the day, they also provided the civil society community with space, as is the practice in past conferences. There's always ways to improve that, but I guess we were a bit concerned before the conference, given the national context and their own practices in terms of civil society's engagement. But when it comes to the UN Fora on the international level, things always look a bit different, and clearly the host makes the utmost efforts to look good also in this regard. So, a snapshot of what we would consider main achievements or milestones from a civil society perspective, and you see the number of attendees. At the end, it was quite a high number of representatives and organizations. Compared to Atlanta 2 years ago, Atlanta was almost double the amount of registrations, which again shows us that the situation is dire for many organizations, and they really have to think carefully about traveling and attending kind of expensive conferences for an entire week. But at the same time, it is a good number, and still significantly higher than the number of representatives from civil society, for instance, from 4 years ago. That was in Egypt, although if you recall, that was during COVID times, which also had a lot of difficulties in terms of traveling. The civil society pre-COSP Civil Society Day on the ground was well attended. It was dynamic. We received good feedback in this regard, and also a few dozens of states parties representatives joined this meeting, although they were invited quite, I would say, last minute because, yeah, the organizational and logistical aspects of this conference were sometimes a bit on a short notice. So we were happy to see that still many states consider this already an important practice before the CoSP, including their own participation, at least at some parts of that civil society preparatory day on site. No surprise that civil society that was there was active, and the engagement was meaningful. If we're talking about the many side events where organizations organized or participated as panel speakers, in the delivery of different plenary statements, in the high amount of written submissions that are published on the UNODC COSP 11 web page. So more than 50 submissions from around 20 different organizations. And also, we're continuing to push for a stronger practice in terms of including civil society representatives in country delegations. And we can see that at this cost, we had 19 representatives, at least that we are aware of, because there always could be a few others that were more silent, and we weren't informed that they were actually included in the country delegation. So this is a good number, and of course, this is extremely useful from a community's point of view, because these delegates, many of them, shared valuable information from different deliberations taking place during the conference, and again, we're talking about a setting that is unchanged, where civil society, non-governmental stakeholders are not allowed to participate in the negotiations of cost resolutions. So in that sense, we don't really know what's happening. And sharing information in this regard could be crucial to have more effective advocacy. We had a civil society declaration in Doha, as we had also in Atlanta, quite a comprehensive one. So that's quite an important milestone, given the fact that this is a very busy conference. And the bottom line, I think, and probably the most important thing from the perspective of the outcomes of the conference is good advocacy, effective advocacy, coordinated advocacy that led to significant impact on many of the adopted resolutions that were prioritized by civil society. I'm not going to go over the entire list of cost resolutions now. I hope you have some kind of an idea of what was discussed and adopted, at least in terms of the titles. The titles here, by the way, are not the official titles of the resolutions. Those you will find in the link that will be posted in the chat. But this is the full list. We're talking about 11 resolutions. The more important ones, again, from a civil society perspective, we will focus on and present a little bit today. It's also important to mention that there was one decision adopted at the conference, and this is a decision to host the 12th session of the Conference of States Parties in Uzbekistan. In terms of priority topics ahead of the CoSP, reminding all of you that we as a network identified the following topics to prioritize in terms of advocating to try and include strong commitments in the different resolutions. And this was based on a community consultation, quite a lengthy one that we had in order really to understand what not only we here in Vienna think are the most important issues, but our community as a whole. And we received many responses in this regard that really informed our prioritization. Okay, we have resolutions. At the end of the day, there's always resolutions adopted, and here are just a few bullet points on what does this actually mean. reminding everyone that the resolutions themselves are non-binding, but they do set the standards for UNCAC implementation, for the implementation of the convention. We expect the states parties to take actions to implement these resolutions, and we'll discuss later what could be our role as civil society to make sure this is actually happening, the action that they should take, and the reporting on the actions that they should be taking. The sponsoring countries, including co-sponsoring countries, are considered to be a signal for strong commitment to the implementation of the resolution. So if you'll see your country name under a certain resolution, you could use this as a advocacy tool, some kind of extra commitment that the country made because of the importance that they attach to the resolution's focus and agenda. It is for the CoSP subsidiary bodies, so the different working groups, to discuss the implementation of the different resolutions. And also, I would provide more details on this a little bit later. Several NGOs, I would say even quite a few, have published very interesting commentary and blogs on specific resolutions and their achievements. We will recognize and refer to these blog posts and this important material in our analysis that my colleague Karina will introduce in just a moment. And again, the bottom line is that we think civil society definitely has an important role to play in monitoring the implementation of these commitments. As non-binding as they are, again, they set the standard for what is considered the way to implement the convention. And this also, of course, how would I say it? We spoke to a very big country just a few days ago with quite a lot of capacity, I would say. And when we asked them, what do you do in-house to discuss the implementation of resolutions? How do you lead that discussion once the COSP is done? To say the least, the response was not great, because that person shared with us that basically there isn't really a kind of structured discussion within the government on the resolutions that were adopted, what are the priorities of the country, what are the important commitments, how to follow up on that. I'm not even talking about a kind of an action plan or a work plan to discuss the implementation, but even the kind of the awareness raising around these resolutions is definitely lacking. And in that sense, we think civil society has a very important, if not crucial, role to play to really make these resolutions count. So I will hand it over to Karina, Senior Analyst of the Coalition, joining us from Washington today. Morning, Karina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yonatan. And today we are releasing our analysis of COSP 11 resolutions from the COSP. So I'm going to do some summary of the key takeaways on our priority topics, as Yonatan had already highlighted what we had prioritized as a community. So in this analysis of COSP 11 resolutions, we've included the following information, and that is the highlights, particularly the aspects of the resolution that advance commitments, including those that go beyond previous ones. And we may also highlight specific commitments that may have been in past resolutions, but we think are important or notable. We've also included in this analysis, importantly, what is missing. And that's really very much related to our community, what we have identified as priorities to address key anti-corruption and civic space issues. And if those did not make it in a resolution, we have noted that those are missing. We've also have a section in the analysis focused on follow-up that's typically by states parties, by the UNODC, where they give very clear mandates, as well for the COSP subsidiary bodies, for example, to collect on good practices and challenges, to have an agenda item at the subsidiary bodies working group meetings on a specific topic, technical assistance, and other types of follow-up mechanisms. And that, again, as Yonatan said, could help CSOs in identifying how they can engage and influence the implementation of the resolution. And then finally, some more information about promoting implementation of resolutions, which we also included in our blog that we put out with key takeaways of the CoSP, ways in which civil society can engage in the implementation and do advocacy with their governments to implement it. Next slide, please. So yeah, just to go over on a few key priority issues. So obviously a very, very critical one for our coalition and for civil society, civic space, and particularly Article 13 on civil society participation. We saw, on an encouraging note, more references to civil society in CoSP 11 resolutions than in CoSP 10 resolutions. And there were some very notable signs of progress. For example, the first time that Indigenous peoples and local communities are recognized in CoSP resolutions. That includes both the environmental crime and corruption and the small island developing states, the SIDS resolutions, which we'll talk about more in detail later. There were also some meaningful follow-up measures in Marrakesh resolution, the follow-up to Marrakesh, that I think are important for civil society. One is for the Secretariat to identify practical recommendations to implement Article 13, and not just to identify those based on getting input from states, publish reports on the input received, and for the prevention working group to discuss and consider. Now, one kind of glaring omission in this is that civil society, it's not specified that civil society should be consulted as well, and there's no specific date on when the working group on prevention would discuss this, although that may be addressed in the future, but in the work plan that they're developing. But I just want to say that we that's one of the key follow-ups for civil society, is to make sure that states and the Secretariat are including civil society, getting our input into those discussions and recommendations. Another important one on Marrakesh was for the prevention working group to discuss facilitating access to information, and that hasn't been discussed or really followed up on in many years. So that would be the 17th session, which is in 2026. And there's a bit more detail, new language on how to ensure effective access to information in that resolution as well. Now, in a lot of areas, civic space and language around that and civil society participation was very challenging. It was watered down. It was weakened in many places across the resolution, or it was a big fight to get it in. I think all of us know that environmental defenders, that was sort of down to the wire, as whether environmental defenders would make it into the environmental crime and corruption resolution, and it didn't at the end of the day. We saw media, academia also taken out in other instances. When you had strong language, I think from the UN, the political declaration from UNGAS, from the Atlanta Declaration in 2023, that oftentimes didn't get in. It's now only in 3 resolutions. There's some good language in the SIDS resolution on creating safe, enabling environments for civil society, whole of society approach. I think 4 operative paragraphs in that resolution focus on civil society, vulnerable groups. So there are some highlights there, but overall it was very challenging. More specifically, given, as Jonathan said, the backdrop to this conference was a very, very challenging environment with shrinking civic space. Language proposals on highlighting those risks to civil society and taking concrete actions to address that, such as developing early warning and protection mechanisms for civil society, did not make it into resolutions. And as we see some of those protection measures, it's very difficult now to get financing for. As far as the outcomes on other priority topics for political finance transparency, I don't really want to steal the thunder because Jorge is going to come with that, but some major, huge advances on that landmark resolution there. And then environmental crime and corruption and climate, as well, very, very challenging negotiations there, but I think that we made some progress in building on previous commitments from Resolution 812, so I'm going to go into more detail there later on. Human rights, obviously also very challenging to get in the CoSP, but interesting that I think we had the most reference to, quote, human rights at this CoSP than at any other CoSP, and there's some very good language on the interlinkages between human rights and corruption into the Marrakesh follow-up resolution. Next slide. What is missing really quickly? Victims of corruption. There's no language in any of the resolutions addressing the victims of corruption. We at least saw a little bit of that covered at the Atlanta cost, but unfortunately didn't see any efforts to really build upon that. Gender and corruption again, some serious backsliding on that given the geopolitical context. There is some language in the SIDS resolution, some new language actually, I think, on specifically collecting gender disaggregated data, which we should really build upon, and linkages with other fora as well. We saw across resolutions, very challenging. Far fewer references to the Sustainable Development Agenda. And again, yeah, other UN fora, we really generally did not see that make it in, although it did make it in some places. Um, uh, uh, Over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Karina. So we'll go a little bit into detail on some of the resolutions as mentioned before. The first one is the resolution that adopted the second phase of the UNCAC implementation review mechanism, the IRM. Something we worked quite hard on as the coalition here in Vienna, but also as a community with a lot of CSOs in this community that actually reached out to their governments and encouraged them to include more commitments to having more inclusive, transparent, effective types of reviews. And what we got is pretty much the following. There's improvements for civil society's participation in the next phase of reviews. The resolution now encourages, does not, of course, oblige, but it encourages states parties under review to consider information from other stakeholders, including civil society, non-government stakeholders, when they're preparing the review reports. This could be in the self-assessment questionnaire, this could be during the country visit, in different stages of the review process. But it really, what's important here, that there's explicit language now in this resolution that calls or encourages states parties under review to allow for the consideration of such information by other stakeholders. And that information should be detailed in the full country report and in an annex to the report. That's also a new feature in the next phase. In the past, if you recall, states were only asked a very simple question: did you involve other stakeholders in your review? Yes or no? And anything that went beyond that was completely voluntary. There was no encouragement really in the resolution itself that launched the first phase at the time to include such information on the list of stakeholders that were actually involved, how they were involved, what kind of recommendations did they have they provided, what from these findings and recommendations they provided actually informed the full report or the recommendations that the country received. All these kind of nuanced aspects are let's say our agenda when we reach out to states parties and really hopefully build the new practice on what does it mean to really engage civil society meaningfully in the country review process, and also how to report on that later on in the full report, in the annex, etc. The review process will now entail more opportunities for enhanced transparency of the whole review process. Those of you who have been engaged in the country review, know probably very well how difficult it is to collect very basic information in terms of who is the focal point on behalf of the government, how to reach out to these people in order to provide input. When will the country visit take place? When is the country report going to be finalized? When is the executive summary going to be published? So all these, like what we would think quite basic information, was quite difficult to obtain in the first phase. And now there's, again, an invitation to the country under review to publish upcoming review visit dates, the estimated dates for the completion of their reviews, which is important because we know that in many cases there are delays, so we can hold governments to account in terms of, if the process is delayed. A very important recommendation that encourages governments to publish a press release, make a press release once the review is completed to raise awareness to the fact that the review exists, including within the government, that in many cases, many departments and offices are not even aware of this review with in-house. And all this information, basically on the timeline, on the review visit date, country visit, etc., should be shared in a document ahead of each IRG session. So let's say 3 months a year, the good practice will be to see quite a few of these, states sharing information, and in that sense, increasing the transparency around the review process. Very importantly, the scope of the next phase is it includes addressing the recommendations that a country under review received in its first phase reviews. Okay, that makes sense. However, some of these reviews are about 15 years old. So, of course, many of the recommendations that they have received could be outdated, and other corruption challenges that developed in the last 15 years since those reviews now also should be addressed in the next phase reviews, because the next phase will have two important legs. One is, again, addressing the recommendations that the country received in older reviews, and also reporting on other information on measures taken related to the implementation of the UNCAC, in shorter words, on additional developments. Okay, additional development beyond what was recommended for the country to do in the older reviews. A very heavy caveat in this regard: it's up to the country under review to report on such measures, right? So this is also kind of a tricky one. And we will have to work hard to encourage the reviewing states, the reviewing countries, to ask hard questions during these reviews, right? And not only to wait for the country under review to provide them with information on additional developments, etc. I don't know, looking at TI's really interesting report on the implementation of Article 13, and how civic space is actually assessed in the UNCAC reports. We see there that there's a huge gap between the actual civic space and the way civic space in the fight against corruption is reflected in those country reports. But again, in a better next phase review, there are now opportunities for other organizations to share information, their perspective, also including on additional developments. And we think this should provide enough momentum for the reviewers to, have a more a realistic, I guess, and less peachy necessarily assessment of the state of UNCAC implementation. I discussed Article 13, but this, of course, goes to each and every article that will be assessed under the different chapters. Also very important, a structured, yet voluntary, again, as the other commitments are, a structured progress reporting process. So one of the main flaws of the old reviews was that there was very little reporting on behalf of the states under review in terms of their follow-up actions, in terms of their measures that they are taking to address the recommendations from the old reviews. And that's why we have these 15-year gaps sometimes without really knowing what the country has been doing in order to implement those recommendations. So now there's an invitation to countries to actually report on a more ongoing basis on what they've been doing to address the findings and the recommendations they received in their reviews. And also here, every 2 years, before a CoSP, before a session of the conference of the states parties, the expectation is to have a long list, if this practice is really lived up to, a long list of countries sharing information on what they've been doing to implement the recommendations from their second phase reviews. Yeah, I'll stop here. And if anyone has questions, again, I'm kind of also looking at the time for today. We're a bit behind schedule, so please continue adding your questions into the chat and your comments as well. And now I would like to hand it over to Jorge Valladares from TI Secretariat to present on the milestone resolution on Resolution 11/7 on political finance transparency. So Jorge, I will stop share my screen and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jonathan and colleagues. Very good to see you all. I will try to be very fast with my presentation, perhaps putting some emphasis on what lies ahead, because as you will find out, there's a lot we can do with this resolution. So I'm really looking forward to being in touch again after this conversation. Let me just start by doing a very brief summary of the resolution. Why this resolution 11/7 on political finance transparency is important. Corinne already said that is the first resolution on Article 7.3. But what is really relevant is that the text of the resolution really goes beyond Article 7.3, which only recommends or encourages countries to enhance transparency in the funding of political parties and election campaigns. So it's become the most comprehensive set of global standards that election observers, anti-corruption watchdogs, EMBs, other legislators have at their disposal to model some of their reforms in their own countries. And also includes a number of shared actions that, or follow-up actions that we think are very relevant. So when I say this goes beyond transparency only, we are also referring to other prevention measures that are also included that refer or connect to other parts of the convention, other obligations of the convention. So let me just propose that the number of commitments that are contained in the resolution that could be estimated in anything between 25 and 35 commitments, depending on how you read them, can be organized in 6 different blocks. No, first of all, transparency. Second, there are commitments to guarantee or to ensure that only clean money gets into politics, to prevent bribery or undue influence. There is a strong oversight commitments. There is also, importantly, civic oversight commitments. Of course, naturally, there is quite a few paragraphs on state neutrality or against the misuse of state resources in elections. And as I mentioned, the follow-up measures. Let me just quickly go through. Of course, this goes beyond transparency, but it's really gone very deep when it comes to transparency. We got in many things we were dreaming of. It goes so to guarantee good transparency, the resolution calls for standardized bookkeeping, so having accounting in standardized formats, etc. Then, of course, the identification of donors, comprehensive reporting to oversight body, and very interestingly, timely publication online, including the identification of donors above certain thresholds that guarantee privacy. But of course, also before elections, which is for us was key because voters need to go to the polls knowing who is funding their candidates. And there is, of course, the recognition of the freedom to seek and receive this political finance information. To prevent bribery and undue influence, the resolution has introduced the notion into the global standards of restricting corporate donations with anonymous source. This is the second best to having beneficial ownership. There was only an agreement on having more or less shell companies outside the donor eligibility. Second, there are caps on donations from public contractors. This is actually quite progressive. Only a third of OECD countries have this, or 2/3 of OECD countries have this, but the resolution calls for this, establishing restrictions on the donations that come from public contractors. There is regulation of third parties that pay for advertising without being a party or a candidate. There is also limits on the amount of donations in general, which is also very progressive, because here the rationale is that any donation that goes above certain threshold could be construed or generate expectation of reciprocity. And then, of course, there is a restriction or a ban of funding by foreign entities or to get an advantage from foreign officials on foreign political parties. Importantly, there is also something on effective oversight body. I won't go in depth through this, but there is very interesting thing here. For the first time, election management bodies or election authorities are recognized in the resolution. There is also the recognition of domestic election observers with the name election monitoring mechanisms, which is good enough, we believe. And of course, the recognition of whistleblowing mechanisms in the context of political finance. And then finally, there are quite a few paragraphs that attack the use or very explicitly call for prohibit or ban the misuse of state resources in election campaigns. There is a lot more to unpack. We'll be happy to do more dedicated briefings on this. We are actually planning a webinar, a global webinar on the 19th of March. You'll all receive some information on the content of the resolution. But let me just give one more minute to describe the follow-up actions in which we think we can all be involved. First of all, in early 2027, there must be the start of collection of information on voluntary basis. We plan to influence this. Of course, anytime starting now, the UNODC could start also develop materials that could be used by election oversight or election management bodies or oversight agencies to develop, to promote effective implementation of the resolution. But then that's also important. But where we think is very important is that in May or June 2027, so in a year from now, the working group on prevention should discuss the good practices and challenges that have been collected through the voluntary mechanism. We invite you all to reach out to us and to discuss ways we can influence this more voluntary reporting and to get very good information from countries. This could decide what the following steps in the implementation of the resolution could be adopted, because at the next CoSP in Uzbekistan, the UNODC will have to report on the implementation of the resolution as well. And finally, there is also an invitation to UNODC to provide technical assistance on this. As I said, please reach out. Young, who was leading our engagement during negotiations, and myself are very ready to take any call and discuss ideas on how we can do this. And of course, fundraise together if that's necessary. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share this.
Thank you very much to Jorge, to you for the presentation. The resolution is ambitious, and it really is a milestone as the first ever dedicated resolution on the topic. And I'm happy that you spoke at the end about implementation and how can civil society become involved in the actual realization of those commitments, soft commitments that were agreed in the resolution. And we will discuss. I will also go a little bit later into certain entry points with regards to, again, engaging in the process of the implementation of the resolution, the reporting thereof, etc. But thank you also for mentioning that. And one more thing, the resolution, I don't know if perhaps Karina maybe said that, but this resolution had a record high of, I think, 659 co-sponsors. So this also signals an important kind of, I would say, a common voice shared by 1/3 of the state's parties, pretty much, that really identify with the commitments that were adopted. And if I come from a country but let's take Sri Lanka, for instance. Sri Lanka joined, I think, quite late and co-sponsored the resolution. That's really good for CSOs in Sri Lanka that, in my understanding, is that they should approach the government and say, hey, we are aware of the fact that you not only adopted this resolution by consensus, but the government actually joined as a co-sponsor of this resolution. We see this as an important commitment, even if symbolic, and now we would be very much pleased to see what you're doing to actually implement this resolution and also to help you in this regard, where civil society has a role to play. So thank you very much, Jorge, for your presentation. I'll share my screen again, because now we will go into a couple of other resolutions where Karina, it's back to you, right, to present on. So
Yes, I'm going to go quickly through this because I know we have a lot after. So now jumping to resolution 11.9 on preventing and combating corruption that facilitates as it relates to crimes that affect the environment. So this builds upon Resolution 812 that was adopted at CoSP 8. And so it's not a follow-up, but a building on. And I think one of the highlights of this resolution really is it lays out many new commitments or elements to help address the gaps and challenges in tackling corruption as it relates to crimes that affect the environment. And I think it really goes across the convention, the articles across the different chapters of the convention, to really try to tackle this problem and just also recognizing the importance of combating organized crime, money laundering, and illicit financial flows. And we see particularly this is a transnational cross-border problem, and the organized crime element becoming even more, I think, prominent in this issue, or more challenging in this issue. So I just wanted to highlight that up front. But as far as what we want to highlight in the resolution, I think there's some very strong operative paragraphs on strengthening enforcement and cooperation, international cooperation, cross-border cooperation. Particularly wanted to highlight one element, one operative paragraph on Articles 59, 49, and 50, using joint investigations, special investigative techniques, more effectively to try to address and tackle this corruption, also asset seizure and recovery, the use of technology, using that because that can also the paper trail on a lot of these environmental crimes can really be where rampant corruption happens. So wanted to highlight some of those as far as on the enforcement elements. As well in this resolution, there's a lot of prevention, anti-corruption tools that are highlighted, included in the operative paragraphs. For example, use and sharing of beneficial ownership information, tackling the role of service providers, the professional enablers that can facilitate this kind of corruption. Access to information specifically linked to enhancing public oversight, transparency and integrity of public-private sector relationships, which should cover lobbying activities. And again, also we should link to the political finance transparency resolution as well. That should be a tool to help address this problem. We did have also procurement in there, public procurement, and also would highlight the non-bonding use guidance that came out with UNODC, with civil society partners on non-essential guidelines to be used for looking at use of technologies to combat corruption in public procurement. And this is a huge issue in the natural resource sector. So just wanted to flag that as well. On civil society participation, I think that the milestone here is that we did have in the preamble the recognition of the vital role of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So that's an important, I think, step in the right direction. It's again how we promote implementation of the rest of the resolution as well. There's also language there on whistleblower reporting and kind of guardrails around that reporting to protect safety of reporting. So those are some highlights. Really quickly on the follow-up, just to say that there's going to be an agenda item focused on this issue. We really want to use that along with, as Jorge was highlighting, the political finance resolution will be reported on. So will this resolution. So we want to do a lot of advocacy this year to really get countries to focus on the commitments and promote implementation, and then hopefully build on that for the discussion that the working group on prevention will be having. I believe that will happen next year. So a lot of important follow-up work on this resolution to be done. Next slide. Now we're running short on time here, so I'm just really quickly have the small island developing states. The highlight here is on the climate change and the climate governance language that was adopted. On climate governance, I want to particularly recognize that we have our first operative paragraph. It's an encouragement of SIDS countries to enhance transparency, integrity, and accountability mechanisms. In climate finance, it's very specific on the planning, disbursement, and oversight. So we really want to build upon this. Obviously, it should have been something that all states parties should adopt. It originally was in the language there for all states parties to adopt. I think small island states, really stood up and defended this language and got even this, OP in the final text, along with recognizing the existential threat that it poses to small island states. And so I think that that's a really important new development that we should build upon. So I think given our time, I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Corinna. I don't see too many questions in the chat. Jorge, there was a question that you already responded where you said that you would share also I think your slides because we weren't really able to see them while you were presenting. So please do. And again, if you have questions regarding the resolutions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. If we will have time, maybe we can even take up a question or two. And now I will hand the floor to my colleague Isabella, project officer here in Vienna at the Coalition, to discuss and to present to you the main findings from the feedback survey on the CoSP. Thank you. Isabella, the floor is yours, and I'm stop sharing. No, I'll keep sharing my screen, right?
Yeah. Thanks, Jonathan. Yes, so thank you so much to everyone who took the time to complete the feedback survey about civil society participation during the CoSP. Your comments and suggestions are really valuable to us. We received just over 50 responses and have tried to consolidate this into a short presentation, but we will also have some time, hopefully after, where you can also share any additional feedback you feel has not been reflected here. Next slide, please. So many participants emphasized that the CoSP was a valuable space for advocacy, networking, and deepening their understanding of current anti-corruption priorities. There was also comments that some felt that their ability to have an impact was limited when they didn't have such good access to delegations. The next slide, please. It was generally perceived that the civil society community had a strong impact, which is great to see, with key resolutions being positively impacted by civil society outputs and advocacy. However, some challenges that participants raised included a lack of political will in some areas, and that it also was difficult to gauge the actual impact of civil society contributions, sometimes during the discussions themselves. There were also suggestions that it would be useful to further improve civil society's capacity, especially those who are newer to the CoSP, and also to make more parts of the CoSP more inclusive for civil society. Next slide, please. So some of the suggestions we received on information that would be useful for follow-up included on monitoring and supporting resolution implementation, especially at the national level, as well as to focus on topic-specific resolution implementation through the coalition's working groups, for example, and especially having information on how the new IRM will be implemented. The next slide, please. So some other material that was highlighted was having summaries and follow-up discussions around initiatives that were presented at side events and looking towards CoSP 12 to start outlining priorities as soon as possible, and also take in consideration where we gained and also where we lost ground at CoSP 11. There was also a recommendation to better coordinate the civil society community around side event topics in advance of the official call for side events. Beyond this, there were suggestions to identify opportunities for regional collaboration and also to potentially share a database of CoSP 11 participants for those who would be willing to be included, to share contact details for follow-up. The next slide, please. So here is an overview of responses about the usefulness of the coalition's resources and activities that were shared throughout the CoSP. So we're pleased to see that the briefings, guidance documents, and submissions were overall useful, but we also take note of the feedback that the volume of these materials were at times difficult to digest. And that in terms of information sharing, the briefings and WhatsApp channels were useful, but sometimes the updates were more general and could perhaps have been more detailed to give a better understanding of ongoing negotiations around language and compromises being made, and overall, perhaps better streamlining of the information. The next slide, please. So it was highlighted that the in-person preparatory meeting was great for networking and aligning on key priorities and getting an overview of the week ahead, especially for those who are newer to the CoSP. Sorry, I think someone's not on mute. But we also received some suggestions to allow for further time for more interactive discussions and networking, regional discussions, and perhaps some more guidance on how to engage with delegations and, if possible, to have more participation from governments during that section. The next slide, please. Yeah, in terms of ways that we can better support CSOs in preparation for COFS 12, there were requests to continue to keep the community informed, continue with these online preparatory briefings, and also provide information on important contact points where that's possible. There were a few suggestions of setting up a mentor system especially for organizations who are more new to the COSP to collaborate more with more experienced organizations in the COSP area, as well as providing capacity building support and information on funding resources. Participants also encouraged to have stronger regional coordination and connections ahead of the COSP. The next slide, please. So getting near to the end, but some other feedback was to perhaps reduce the number of priority areas that we focus on to avoid spreading ourselves too thin and to support further engagement with governments. There was also a suggestion to provide one-pagers on the priority areas to be used in advocacy engagement with delegations, and also to think beyond focusing on individual resolutions and consider a broader theory of change in anti-corruption efforts around the UNCAC. The next slide, please. Yeah, and so we also received requests for an analysis of government plenary statements and guidance on accessing and using COSP materials in future advocacy work. And then the last slide. So yeah, our main takeaways from the valuable feedback that you provided was to continue with such briefings and providing resources, but perhaps to better streamline the information and provide more topic-specific guidance, especially around advocacy capacity building and further support for first-time attendees. The COSP had a perceived strong impact of civil society, but be helpful to reduce the priority areas and increase regional coordination. And in terms of follow-up, to focus on resolutions and priorities for COSP 12 ahead. So yeah, thank you once again for your feedback, suggestions, and kind comments. We really appreciate it.
Isabella, thank you very much for the overview of the feedback survey and its main findings. I think you had the most difficult job because you know, the advice that we get, the recommendations for the future, I think were very concise, very concrete also. And that shows, usually that comes from people that are really engaged in these processes, right? Then they have good advice besides kind of the general comments on what worked well and what not. So I won't do justice if I will highlight just a few, but really there's a long list of I think ways to improve, and thanks again to the 55 people that really took the time to respond to this survey. The last minutes of the session now I will dedicate to discuss basically follow-up and opportunities for advocacy, of course, with the focus on this year. I will not be able to cover everything, But I'm reminding you again that we will share the recording and these slides probably a couple of days after this briefing on our COSP 11 webpage. So in front of you, you can see now first the calendar for the subsidiary bodies in 2026. And just to highlight that on the margins of the May sessions of the Implementation Review Group, that's the IRG, and the Prevention Working Group, on the margins of those meetings, we will also have the NGO briefing. That briefing is open for COSP 11 observers from civil society. So if you were accredited to the COSP in Doha, even if you haven't attended eventually in person, it means you can also show up to the NGO briefing that will take place between the 18th and the 22nd of May on one of those days. I think also important to mention from this slide, from this calendar, is the COSP special session to adopt the review mechanism next phase key documents. And I will go into that a little bit into detail. This doesn't happen every year that there's a COSP special session. But again, you also, the COSP Fora also does not launch the next phase of any of their reviews every year or not every decade. Therefore, they decided to hold a special session in order to adopt these documents that will be developed this year and will also provide an important entry point for civil society's advocacy. In terms of the relevant discussions that will still take place this year, in 2026, the most relevant discussions from our point of view, according to the issues of priority that I mentioned before, is again, the IRM next phase key documents basically will be discussed throughout the entire year in all the different sessions, in May, in September, and later through their adoption, hopefully, in this special session in November. Resolution 11.4 on a follow-up to the Marrakesh Declaration on the prevention of corruption. In that resolution, there was a mandate to discuss access to information and anti-corruption education. Those two topics will be on the agenda in the working group in May. Again, these working groups are closed to civil society observers in their organizational capacity. If a civil society representative joins a country delegation, also for the subsidiary bodies, as was the case for the COSP, that's completely fine. But in our organizational capacity, we cannot actually sit in these meetings and listen to the discussions and monitor the way they're being held. Back to COSP 10, but still a very important resolution is Resolution 10.5 on corruption, links between corruption and transnational organized crime. In November, within the context of the International Cooperation Expert Meeting or Working Group, there will be another discussion on this topic. Resolution 11/8 on collaboration between anti-corruption bodies or agencies and financial intelligence units will also take place in the Asset Recovery Working Group meeting in November. Another important discussion that will take place during that meeting is basically a first discussion on what should be a future, another COSP special session. I just said before that this doesn't happen every day, but in this case, there will be a future COSP special session, not sure exactly when, on asset recovery. If you recall, the UNGAS, the UN General Assembly special session against corruption, decided that the COSP will hold a special session on asset recovery in order to contemplate or consider other ways to advance the issue of asset recovery, which is obviously a serious challenge in terms of the implementation of the convention. This may include also discussing other relevant frameworks, other new ideas, other international mechanisms and tools, etc. So there's a first discussion on that, probably within the Asset Recovery Working Group in November this year. Another, again, entry point for our advocacy to influence those discussions. In 2027, Jorge and Corina already mentioned that there will be discussions on political finance transparency and corruption and the environment. following the resolutions adopted in this regard. But also, Karina, you mentioned that there will be a discussion on practical measures, and the emphasis on the word practical. Practical measures for ensuring civil society or non-government's participation in anti-corruption efforts. Hopefully, this discussion indeed will take place in 2027, and there will be room, even if it's informal, for civil society to influence any findings and any recommendations that will come out of that discussion. Possible action in terms of really what can we do at this point. And I'll already say that there will, again, I'm mentioning this a few times, but we will not have time to discuss in detail each and every bullet point. But you could see that as part of the CoSP 11 feedback survey, one of the important feedback that we received there was to hold more dedicated sessions and share more information on what you can do in terms of a CoSP follow-up, in terms of implementing the resolutions. So here you have a few ideas on what could be done around the process of resolution implementation, and I'll mention them very quickly. I said it before, you can advocate to include a civil society in a country delegation just to be able to follow the relevant discussions within the subsidiary bodies where civil society cannot be in their organizational capacity. Jorge mentioned as an example that in 2027 there will be a questionnaire sent out by UNODC to the states parties requesting for information on what they're doing to implement that resolution on political finance transparency. That's a voluntary questionnaire, right? So states are not required, obliged to respond to that questionnaire. Hence, we as civil society may play an important role to encourage the government to actually respond to that questionnaire, respond in a comprehensive manner, in a correct manner, possibly also feed civil society's input into such government responses. And if not, also civil society has the opportunity to publish their own independent assessments, if you'd like, mini parallel reports, so to say, in parallel to the government's reporting on information. It is important to say that on some of the working group sessions and web pages, including the prevention working group and the asset recovery working group of the CoSP, right, not the coalition asset recovery working group, there's a growing practice where states basically publish the information that they share with the Secretariat as a response to those different questionnaires. They publish that information on the actual webpage of the working group session, which allows all of us to look at that, to see if the state, actually responded. What did they include in this note? Of course, there's very varying, I would say, levels of detail. Some report, very comprehensively. Some other states parties basically do a copy paste of their plenary statement with no editing. So that's an important resource for all of us to be aware of. There's always the possibility to organize, to be part of an event on the margins of the different sessions of the working group. So it's not considered a special event like in the CoSP. It doesn't have a formal name, but at the end of the day, there is the possibility to be part and to organize such discussions and such events in collaboration with states parties throughout the year, including online. And of course, again, very importantly, at the end of the day, these resolutions, with all due respect to the CoSP fora and the different deliberations that take place here in Vienna, if it's not implemented and if it's not taken forward by the countries themselves, there's serious doubts regarding the seriousness of the implementation of resolutions. And therefore, a general encouragement is always to engage with your governments in terms of implementing the resolution, asking them to share information on what they do in this regard. And we are happy and we will produce more concrete kind of ideas and tools, such as a template letter that you can use to reach out to your government on how to encourage them with regards to specific resolutions of interest. The CoSP special session to adopt the IRM next phase documents. I mentioned this already before. It will take place in November between the 2nd and the 6th, one day between the 2nd and the 6th. We don't know exactly when. The objective is to adopt the new self-assessment questionnaire that will serve as the basis for the country review, and also the templates for the full country report and the executive summary. I shared with you before a few details on how these templates should now look like, and that they include other features that are relevant to civil society. And we think we also should have a role in shaping these documents, but also informing the country's different positions on how these documents should actually look like. Including, for instance, how will the self-assessment questionnaire look into implementation in practice? This is a quote from the actual resolution on the next phase, where countries are basically requested to share information on their implementation in practice, right? What does this mean in practice? This goes beyond the legal framework in our perspective, whether they have it or not, but we want to see actual results, tangible results, sharing statistics, case studies, etc. We like to see all this reflected in the self-assessment questionnaire, in the country report template, etc. There will be, let's say, quite soon already, an outreach to you, to the community, asking you, inviting you to be part of these efforts to influence these important documents, and then later to reach out to the states parties to inform their own positions ahead of these important discussions that will take place throughout 2026, starting in May in the IRG. There are a few other points that I'm mentioning here in the slides with regards to possible input from civil society. This is on a corruption measurement effort that UNODC has developed. It has been developing, and the practical guide in this regard will share more information through an email very soon. You can also see here basically what are the different fora or the different spaces where you can find information on CoSP follow-up. I already included, without a date yet, but I included the CoSP 11 second follow-up briefing, where we will really focus on specific entry points, specific possible actions that we can take as a community or as CSOs on the national level to really promote the implementation of the different commitments from CoSP 11, from CoSP 10. Well, let's not forget that those are also still very relevant. We're already 10 minutes after the hour. Yeah, there are a few more resources that are in the pipeline and that we will publish also very soon, including a summary of the different plenary statements that were delivered throughout the week in the CoSP plenary, information on a very important report that came out of UNODC on the state of implementation of chapters 2 on prevention and 5 on asset recovery, where we will share some information from that, I think, 900-page report that is not very user-friendly, although comprehensive. So please continue following our CoSP 11 webpage. It will continue to be a live webpage. We will share the updates there. And if you have specific questions, if you want to engage and you want to brainstorm about ideas on what you can do on the national level, how to engage within your government, how to engage within the CoSP fora, to be still part of implementation efforts and follow-up efforts, because it is clear by now that this is a huge blind spot. The word follow-up to the CoSP is too soft, too voluntary in this sense. And again, we think civil society should play an important role to step up our efforts, not only in influencing the outcomes of the conference, but actually its follow-up by states parties. So this is really the main message from this briefing today. And I would really like to encourage you to engage, to reach out to me personally or anyone within the coalition to have more detailed discussions and address more specific questions that you may have in this process, because the information is always, there's so much and it's always a bit overwhelming. So please feel free to reach out and I will be happy to take these discussions to a bilateral space as well. So thank you very much, everyone, for staying also almost 15 minutes longer in today's briefing, and best regards from Vienna. See you soon. Goodbye.